Hello everyone, it's a pleasure to make your acquaintance, and welcome to my Imaginarium Theater walkthrough. Just like last time, people seem to really enjoy me doing something a bit more casual, a bit more narration style, so I'm going to keep going with that. This isn't going to be a really in-depth guide. I'm not going to have like precise breakdowns of bosses and every single enemy you could face, but I will still be narrating through why I made certain decisions at certain points. There's not going to be as much also vocal editing, less cropping, more umming, more R-ing, less YouTube enunciation and spiel. So I hope you enjoy this and we can get into it. As you can probably see, I've already started on the visionary mode, which is the max difficulty where you have to take between 22 and 26 characters. And I aim to get all stars and rewards if I can. Again, we're also doing this 4-star only, so all 4-star characters, all of my 4-star characters are at least level 80 or level 90. They all have decent investment, as in they've all got fully leveled 5-star artifacts. They all have fully leveled weapons, probably at high refinements. Some of them being battle pass or gacha weapons, which might be hard to get your hands on. And all of their talents are leveled to a reasonable degree. I think most of them are level 6 if they're 80, and most of them are level 8 if they're 90. There are exceptions like Bennett and Neon-san both have Crown Burst, but keep in your mind that this isn't just a 4-star clear. This is a well-invested 4-star clear. So for example, like Auron, I think most of them are C6, but for Auron, he was C4, but then I happened to, in the previous week, get a extra Auron constellation through the standard banner pulls, the few standard banner pulls you get, and then the event gave me C6, so he is C6 here. Not that he's used very much. I think I used him like one time. Auron is not great this Imaginarium Theater. He does give you buffs which are useful, but he requires you to use an on-field driver that's Night Soul, and 4 stars don't have that really. If you have 5-star characters like Chaska or Moika, then he can still be really good. Also the 5 stars, I didn't take any of the 5 stars. I've taken the trial versions of the 5 stars. So they've already got they're level 18, they've got whatever artifacts they have on them. I didn't take Traveler as well because I consider Traveler to be a 5-star, mainly because people will complain if I take them, much like I do in my 4-star Abyss runs. I'll take like Cole instead of Pyro main, instead of Dendro main character. But hopefully this gives you the impression that you absolutely do not need specific 5-star characters or specific constellations on them or signature weapons to be able to complete this. You just need a well-built variety of characters. So to start here, I'm taking a couple of characters that will help me get through the chamber. So I'm taking Zhao, but I'm also taking Sarah and Razor and Toma, who I don't consider to be excelling characters. Now Toma is quite useful because of his fire application. Razor can be good, but I've got him built full elemental mastery. So Zhao's just going to get me through these early chambers, and the early chambers are easier. So if you want to get rid of certain characters you don't think are very good, maybe you've got in another Imaginarium Theater a Barbara and they're not going to be doing a lot of damage, just some healing. Maybe you want to get rid of them. Use them early on so that you can get more characters that are better that you want to save against certain bosses or use later. That's exactly the same reason that I picked up Sayu here, because I didn't think she was a great character, and so I don't want to get her later or be forced to take her later. I want to take stronger characters later. Okay, going back to the characters I chose, because I can yap a bit more, the only character 4-star that I didn't take, because I did have 27 to pick from, was Amber, because she's going to be doing the most damage. But I wanted to take all the extra characters I could because they give you more starting buffs, more extra HP, more attack, elemental mastery, all of that stuff. And I also didn't borrow a character. I did look for a Yanfei because my Yanfei's only 80. It would be cool to have a super invested one, but I couldn't find one for my friends to borrow from. But if you can borrow a character because they will be invaluable to you. Like if you can borrow a really strong 5-star character, maybe with some constellations, maybe with a signature weapon, they can get you through some of those chambers for free with just some random supports. Oh, and I also forgot to mention, I'm going to try and get all the stars in this, but you don't need to get stars yourself. Don't try to force yourself to get all the rewards if you can't, if it's painful. But more than that, the stars don't actually affect any of the rewards you get. So don't pressure yourself to get them if you can't already. Into this chamber, it's another early chamber, it doesn't matter too much, but I took Sara because Sara pairs really well with Clorand. She actually buffs up her damage a lot. Sara's not great with that many characters, but characters that have quite a lot of high electro damage, so probably you could use her with Varessa as well. But Raiden, Sara does really well with those characters because she buffs up attack, but she also buffs up at C6 that electro damage. I also left in a restart here rather than editing it out because I think I did edit out some of the others later and some of the rewinds, but I think it's important to show that you can restart. Take your time. If you didn't get a great run, but you were close, you can restart. Don't get super frustrated at it. There's always another chance, right? So quickly going back to those characters you can borrow, you could also look, if you can't borrow one from your friends list, you can also either just add random people that you see that have cool characters in their showcase, but you can also find Reddit threads or Discord threads about people that are willing to share their characters with you. And we're actually through 2 chambers now, so we're going to go into a boss next. And it's going to be the first boss that you face, everybody faces the exact same bosses, which is going to be the Nemesis of Coppelius. Nemesis of Coppelius only really has one main mechanic to them, which is that after a certain point in the fight, they will summon a cryo ward. Now, it's quite a small cryo ward, so luckily you're kind of already bringing the ideal characters to break it, which are Pyro and Electro. There is one other way to instantly break that shield, and that's by bringing Osea, the purple version of the Numero Osea combo. And Clorand has that, which I'm taking here. But Chevreuse also has it, although I would probably save Chevreuse till later because she's a really strong character in this Imaginarium Theater, especially for the Hydro Tulpa you face later. You can also bring Lynette. Lynette also has it, or the Quest Sword that you can align to be Osea. And that while that mechanic is going on, while that shield or ward is summoned on the enemy, the pair, the other dancer, the lady, whatever she's called, will be circling round the outside throwing wind blades at you. Wind blade! Okay. But those are quite deadly. They can hurt quite a lot, especially in Abyss. I remember that hurting a lot. So be careful of them. Take a shielder, take a healer, or just try to track her and dodge them. Yeah. Okay, here you can see me debating over taking Xiangling or Auron. I decided on Xiangling because I want to save Auron for later when I'm facing the Nemesis or the Papilla or those kind of Abyss wards that you can come across. Because we definitely do fight the Papilla at some point later, and Auron, because he's Night Soul, does a lot of hits, so he's useful for that. Though of course we don't have any Hydro here, so we can't proc Electro Charge reaction, so Auron's a bit weaker, but we'll deal with it. Anyway, the last thing I was talking about was picking support characters and getting one from a friend. Going back to that, when you're choosing your characters, I also wouldn't actually recommend, unless you absolutely have to take up the numbers, taking the special invitation characters, which are the characters which are other elements than the Imaginarium Theater is. At the start, they used to be really good because they'd allow you to do like a vaporized team when there was no Hydro and only Pyro. But now those characters, because they buff the blessings a lot more, they just don't interact with the blessings at all, so you're really nerfing your team if you're relying on those characters. Like this Imaginarium Theater, you could take Alhaitham and Electro characters to make an aggravate team, which will work okay for him. But the problem with that is that you're not triggering Swirl with Electro, you're not triggering Overload either, and so he refuses to kind of interact with some of the reactions. Yeah, I don't think they're the best to take unless you have to. So, if you can't tell, I started off this chamber and I'm quite struggling. The enemies are very spread out. I can't remember if I purposely chose a slightly harder version of this, but unless I was going to bring along a Sucrose, then I was kind of stuffed for this and didn't have too many options. So, I actually trial and errored this for quite a while, and I ended up rewinding, as you'll see in a moment. Definitely for these defend the ley line, protect the monolith chambers, you have 2 options to deal with them, as we talked about last Imaginarium Theater. You can either go the route of, okay, I'm going to pick a few enemies to fight against, so one where it's 1 or 2 spawning maximum at a time, and I'll distract them. I'll keep their attention, I'll slowly whittle them down, and because it's only 1 or 2 enemies, it's easy to keep aggro on them, especially if you have a taunt on top of that to stop enemies attacking the monolith. The other option is that you can have strong grouping and area-wide damage. So Venti is really, really good at these chambers. Kazuha is great, Sucrose is great. Or characters like Nervlet, which are just able to beam so many of these enemies in one go, even though they're spread out throughout the chamber. Obviously, we can't take Nervlet here, but as an example of a character that could hit a wide area, because you need to defend that Monolith in one of those two ways. Because otherwise, if they're too spread out, you're just going to have ranged attackers attacking it. If you have very single target damage, like Yoimiya I was taking here, one of the worst characters to take in this, because she's so single target. Okay, yeah, so it looks like I didn't take one that was particularly harder. They were all worth 105. But I picked a different one this time. Instead of picking the one with the Saurian enemies, I picked one with the Fatui. And seeing as there's only 2 of them at a time, this is a lot better for me to deal with. And it also means I get to save Sucrose, who's one of my strongest units in a 4-star run in this Imaginarium Theater. And then I can take a slightly weaker team with characters that aren't going to be as prevalent or useful throughout the chambers, and get rid of those characters early and keep more valuable characters like the Garming I picked up. And Garming is really, out of all the characters you can get at the moment for 4-star runs, Garming's like one of the premier units. He's going to do amazingly against so many enemies, so I'm glad I was able to pick him up. I also want to talk quickly about the reason why getting rid of weaker characters earlier is better. It's not just better because they have lower stats, because they have lower numbers, because they're not well invested, but a difference in character and enemy level directly correlates to less damage. As in, if you have a level 80 character against a level 90 enemy and a level 90 character against a level 90 enemy, and they have the exact same stats, the one that's level 90 will be doing more damage because the damage you do scales on the difference in level. That's why if you're much higher level and you go to a friend's world or a co-op world, it's not only feeling like you're doing so much damage because your characters are more invested, but on top of that, the level difference is increasing the damage that you do. So that's why if you have particularly under-leveled characters, it's useful to get rid of them early. Here I'm using Lisa for the defense shred that she gives from her burst. Dory's helping funnel some energy into Zhao, and Beto's pretty good when you're facing 2 opponents, so the damage in this team isn't too underwhelming. The real struggle would be Zhao's burst, but I kind of had Dory to prop him up. Anyway, either way, as you can see, I'm not doing the most damage, but that doesn't matter. And I'm always running over to the ranged enemies first, because the melee enemies will jump to me and chase me, as you can see. And because I'm keeping distracted the whole time, they're never focusing the Monolith, which means it's never taking any damage. So I could theoretically stall out for as long as I wanted. It doesn't matter at all about taking them down and defeating them, because they'll just be busy looking at me anyway. Oh, and I also wanted to mention why I didn't decide to do a really full, in-depth guide for this, testing every enemy and going through the numbers and stuff. Because, the reason is that, first of all, that takes a hell of a lot of time. So I tried doing that last Imaginarium Theater, and the amount of time it was taking me for testing, it just wasn't worth it for the amount of views that I'll get on an Imaginarium Theater view, like for the time that I have to do this stuff, and how useful it would be to people. And secondly, it's that a lot of the choices I ended up realizing don't really matter too much. It's important to know the enemies, so knowing how to take down the bosses is important, and the mechanics to deal with them. But the individual chambers aren't too significant, but more than that, the blessings, it doesn't seem to matter which ones you take. You generally end up getting similar rewards from them all, as long as you're taking ones that correspond to your roster. So if you have a lot of Animo and Pyro characters, you should take the Animo and Pyro buff, because if you take the damage one of that route, or you take the damage one of another route, they both end up doing about the same damage. The only difference is the ones which are like utility or buffing, so when it reduces enemies' resistances, or it heals you, or things like that. And that depends on the characters you're taking. If you have a lot of Pyro damage dealers, then taking one that reduces enemies' Pyro resistance is probably better than taking the flat damage one. But for me, because I'm using 4 stars only and the damage ceiling of those characters is a bit lower, I prefer to just take the damage-orientated buffs. If you do want more in-depth Imaginarium Theater guides, there definitely are ones out there. I'm sure you can just search them up on YouTube. There's other guide makers that do great jobs of them. So this chamber was probably one of the hardest ones I faced, and it took me a lot of different teams to work out what was best here. I ended up using Sucrose, Fischl for the Electro, and Lynette because she does taunt damage and she's able to hit multiple targets. I actually have Lynette on more of a damage build as well here, mainly because I only have so many sets of Viridescent. If you have lots of sets of Viridescent, great. If you don't, you can either build your characters on slightly alternative builds, or honestly just putting them on level 0 artifacts as long as it's Viridescent if they're Animo, so you can get that shred on enemies is pretty useful. But this chamber really shows off the power of Sucrose when you're playing against multiple enemies, the power of grouping, the fact that I'm able to constantly move around, group enemies, hit them with damage, hit multiple of them damage. Anytime I'm also triggering an Electro Swell. That means Fischl is doing more damage. I'm proccing lots of the blessings. All that combined just about gets me through this chamber. I should probably also talk about some of the more useful teams and useful characters, or important characters in this Imaginarium Theater. I guess from my team's perspective, but just generally. So we have Pyro, Animo, and Electro. Of course, that means we get Pyro Swells, we get Electro Swells, and we get Overload, which are really very amplifying reactions. So for me, the strongest character would have been Chevreuse, because Chevreuse is able to reduce resistance of enemies when you have a Pyro and Electro only team, and she can do that at C0. So she's really useful for taking those exclusively Pyro and Animo teams. On the other hand, characters that rely more on reactions, so Garming isn't so strong unless you're taking him against enemies which will infuse themselves. I mean, a Chevreuse team is still good for Garming, but just a regular Overload isn't as good. But that also means for some characters, you can take purely Overload builds. So if you're running Xiangling, and in an Electro team, we have a lot of Electro damage dealers. Her ultimate, spinning round, going to hit the enemy lots of times, proc lots of overloads because no ICD on Xiangling's burst, so you can actually build her full Elemental Mastery and get similar damage that you would normally. Okay, and the next enemy we're going to come up against is the Papilla. The Papilla is back in Imaginarium Theater after being really annoying in Abyss. And if you do want some tips for teams that are good against them, they're in lots of my Abyss guides, and I go over pretty much how to deal with them there. But if you want, I will cover some of it here. So the Papilla ward is very special in that it counts the number of hits of damage you do to it. It doesn't matter about internal cooldown, how much elements you apply, you just need to do as many hits as you can. Now, we don't have teams that would normally be really good against this, like Hyperbloom or Taser or that kind of thing. And also, just to note, because it's quite important, not that I'd be able to do it here, but Night Soul characters, every time they do a hit, they get 3 times the hit. So Chaska, because she's doing 6 shots, is amazing at dealing with this. Auron's also pretty good. Characters that swell a lot, surprisingly, like Sayu and Venti, because they're doing a crazy amount of swirls. Like if you just spin round the boss on Sayu, you do a lot of swirls. That also counts as a lot of hits. Fischl is amazing, as you can see I'm using here. Fischl, every time when she C6, your character does normal attacks. Oz also shoots another attack, and Oz is shooting his regular attacks. And when you trigger reactions, Fischl is applying an attack, so you get so many attacks out with that, and Xiangling is also helping to apply a lot here, so all those characters combined are very useful. There's lots of creative ways to deal with this, but characters like Lisa can be good, characters with a lot of off-field hits generally, so Lynette can also be really good for this because she's triggering swells. So try a variety of teams if you're getting stuck on this, but you want to do as many hits as possible, and reactions count for that. Actually, if you do take a Dendro character here, Burning is also incredibly effective at dealing with the Papilla shield. So it was a little bit annoying that I had to use Fischl there, but it is what it is. I saved those characters to use against important enemies, and the Papilla is a pretty important enemy. I also am pretty confident that the Papilla that you face here is very much like the Overworld Papilla. It's not like the Abyss Papilla, which has a higher ward of 72 units. This should only need, I think, 54 units. And so, if you want to check if a team can beat it, pause it, go in the Overworld, and go test it. And if you can break the team with it, if you can break the ward with it in the Overworld, you should be able to do it in Theater as well. Also, please ignore the chat. It was just someone I met recently. They were helping me with some stuff in the Overworld. Not just like self-promo in my video. That'd be kind of weird. So I don't actually have that many characters left to choose from. I still want to save Garming for the Tulpa, because Garming's very important there. So I'm going to use Auron, I'm going to use Razor. I'm going to use a team that doesn't really do too much damage, but what happens here is that because I have Lynette on a damage build, and I have Fischl to, and I have Farazan to buff up Animo damage, I'm just going to let Lynette and Farazan carry. Once you have really high investment on Farazan, once you have high constellations, which I know are hard to get and very limited, and people always complain about this, but she does an incredible job at buffing up Animo characters. So those two characters combined are going to do a lot. Auron also here, I realized, isn't really doing a lot. Auron, because he's on the scroll set, will buff up when he triggers a reaction, but he can't trigger an Animo swirl because enemies can never have like an Animo aura on them. They can never be in a state where they're happy to have Animo on them. So if you put Electra on them, you're never triggering Animo. It's only the Animo characters that are triggering it, which means he wasn't buffing anything there, but I guess he did some damage. It's also nice in the 4-star runs because I do have quite a lot of healers to pick from. Okay, we have the Tulpa now. So the Tulpa is kind of annoying to deal with this in Abyss. I'm really happy I got Chevreuse here for 2 reasons. So the Tulpa, you will get free vaporizers on from your Pyro characters. You also get free Electro charged from your Electro characters, and because if you're bringing Electro and Pyro, then the enemy's going to have Electro on it when you are playing Pyro, so you also get a bunch of overloads. So you're getting a lot of reactions for free with these teams. Now, normally, because the Tulpa always has Hydra on them, you can't swirl Pyro. You can't apply Pyro and then swirl it because they constantly have Hydra on them, and the same applies for Electro. Now, Chevreuse here is the exception. Chevreuse is able to reduce the resistances of enemies to Pyro and Electro if your team is only Pyro and Electro. So she's amazing against a Tulpa or these Hydra-infused enemies. So the only mechanic you really have to worry about for the Tulpa is that it does this move where it tries to absorb one of the mini Tulpas, we're going to call them. And when it does this, it will stand still for a little while and connect to one of the mini Tulpas. You can see a tether between it and the mini Tulpa. And all you need to do is break the ward or the shield on the mini Tulpa and it will be instantly defeated. You can do this by applying Pyro and Electro or even Animo. Just any combination of those stop it from being absorbed, because if you let it be absorbed, not only is the Tulpa going to do much more damage with its following attacks, but it also gains resistances until it's completed those attacks and shrunk back down. So you kind of want to avoid this at all costs. You can preemptively try to weaken the mini Tulpas a little bit, but you want to make sure that you don't accidentally hit them with any of your abilities. But I also really like Garming here, because Garming really benefits from doing reactions, from having Cryo or Hydra on the enemy, so his few instances of big damage do even more damage. And so now that I'm using Garming here, he gets those free vaporizers on the enemy to amplify his big damage and his rare occasions. So he benefits a lot from fighting the Tulpa. I really enjoy using this team here. But any character that's like Diluc or Mawika, any character that has big instances of pyro damage will really make this chamber very, very easy. I'm able to get Ian-san as well, which is a nice benefit. I would have liked to get her earlier, really. Her in that chamber would have been useful, but she's going to be a very generally useful character throughout. Characters like Zhang Ling and Fischl and certain characters in the game are able to snapshot their abilities. Like when they use their abilities, the stats that they have at that moment are saved. And so for Ian-san, even though Zhang Ling can't move around very easily and keep up the buff that Ian-san gives, at the start, Ian-san gives her max buff. And so Zhang Ling uses her burst then, and she's able to capture all those stats, all that attack that Ian-san is buffing on Zhang Ling. And it doesn't matter that that will fall off eventually, because her burst saves the stats that she has. And the same thing happens with Fischl. Though most newer characters don't have abilities that work that way. It's very few and far between. But the most significant ones are generally Fischl and Zhang Ling. So again here, I picked to fight more Hydro-infused enemies because I know I have Chevreuse and I know I have Garming. Now, this might have been a little bit of a mistake because that means I now don't have either of those characters for the last boss, and the Overload team would have still been quite strong. But it does make this chamber really easy to complete. You'll see how quickly I deal with these enemies. I mean, Garming's pretty well invested anyway. I did talk about how strong he was earlier. But yeah, picking to go against Hydra enemies specifically, knowing I get all these free reactions on them, it's a big benefit to me when I have Chevreuse in the team. So we're now going into the last chamber. We made it all the way through. We have one more boss to face, which is the ASIMON. I'm not going to say its full name because I can't remember it off the top of my head. But ASIMON has only kind of one mechanic where it will go invisible after a short time. There's a couple of ways of stopping it going invisible, but the reason you want it to stop going invisible is because when it's invisible, it has a huge, like 200 extra resistances. So you want to stop it going invisible if you can, or break it out of invisibility. And the way to stop it being invisible is you either break after a little bit in the fight, it will summon parts on the ground. You'll either want to break those as soon as it spawns, and that will stop it from going invisible at all until it can spawn some more of them. As it's gone invisible, you can apply a catalyze reaction to it, which is any combination of Electro and Dendro, but I don't have any Dendro here. Or you break one of its parts after it's gone invisible, and then it tries to repair itself. And when it's repairing itself, it summons 2 more parts which have Dendro on them, and you just need to apply some Electro to that. And if you do either of those ways, where you do an actual mechanic to break it and don't just wait for it to come out of invisibility, because after you've broken its parts and it's tried to repair itself, it will come out of invisibility. Or after breaking those parts and it repairing itself, you can just wait for it to come out of invisibility, as it will do. Now, if you do the mechanic, after it's come out of invisibility, it will paralyze itself for a while, which doesn't really make many differences, but it does make it easier to hit for a little while. I don't know if it actually changes the time that it is available to hit, but it's worth thinking about. As you can see, those parts do have quite a lot of health, so you want to focus on destroying them. But I was able to get through this, and it did take me a few attempts, but Sethos managed to carry me through with the damage and the snapshotted burst from Zhang. And well, that's it. That's all of Imaginarium Theater done for this season with a 4-star only run. Ta-da! Why am I clapping for myself? If you have any other questions, feel free to put them down in the comments. If you like this, if you'd like me to do a more in-depth guide and like my other guide for Imaginarium Theater, let me know. But if you prefer this version and you enjoyed this, then let me know as well. Either way, best of luck with Imaginarium Theater. Try to remember the tips I said. Use the characters that are worse early. Borrow a character from a friend if you can. And also, a little birdie may have told me that while Imaginarium Theater still doesn't give you very much for stars, in the future, I think that might change. So be aware of that. That might also be lucid dreaming, but you get the idea. Garming doing a large amount of damage is not a surprise. I'll just let these run through because I can yap for a bit. And also, thank you for all the support on the last videos and all of the videos in general. It's amazing. Supporting cast none. Yeah. Also, you'll notice throughout I took all the mystery caches I could when I could. You should take mystery caches. They're mostly going to be bonuses. Try to be smart about the ones that you take. Like, I picked one where I had a 67% chance of getting 90 flowers. I didn't get it, which is a bit annoying. But the one that gave me 15 after every battle that I got early gave me so many more points and made the teams I could pick from much more flexible. But yeah, thank you very much and have a lovely week. Bye-bye.